It was Christmas Eve, and the roads leading into the sleepy town of Pinehurst were blanketed in a thick layer of snow. Julie had been driving for hours, her hands gripping the steering wheel tighter with each passing mile. The storm had come out of nowhere, turning her casual drive to visit family into a treacherous journey. Pinehurst wasn't her first choice for holiday plans, but her grandmother had insisted on having everyone together this year, even if it meant braving the harsh mountain terrain. The car's heater hummed, but it did little to warm the chill that crept into her chest as she spotted something in the road ahead. Squinting through the snow, Julie slowed the car, her headlights revealing the outline of a figure standing motionless. A man, wearing a long, tattered coat, was in the middle of the road, holding a lantern that cast an eerie glow in the surrounding darkness. Julie's heart raced. She rolled down the window slightly, letting in a gust of icy air. "Are you okay?" she called out, her voice shaky. The man didn't respond. He simply pointed toward a narrow dirt path that veered off the main road. Julie glanced at her GPS, but it was frozen, refusing to load the map. She weighed her options. She could turn back and try another route, but that would cost her hours. Or she could trust the man's silent guidance and hope he was pointing towards safety. "Thanks," she muttered under her breath, her gut telling her she'd regret the decision even as she made it. She turned down the path, the tires crunching over the uneven snow. The road was narrow and winding, the trees on either side creating a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. Julie felt the world closing in around her. The snowstorm had worsened, and she could barely see a few feet ahead. Her hands tightened on the wheel as the car suddenly jolted to a stop. "Not now," she groaned, stepping out into the cold to investigate. Her car's back wheels had sunk into a hidden ditch, the snow disguising the hazard perfectly. She tried pushing, but it was no use. She was stuck. Julie scanned her surroundings, her breath visible in the freezing air. That was when she saw it, a faint light flickering through the trees. It was far off but steady, like a beacon. She hesitated. The logical part of her brain screamed to stay with the car, but the light offered a sliver of hope. Wrapping her scarf tighter around her neck, she trudged through the snow, her boots sinking with every step. The light led her to a cabin. It looked ancient, the wood dark and weathered, the windows frosted over. Smoke curled from the chimney, and a wreath hung on the door, though it was wilted and brown. Julie knocked hesitantly, her gloved hand trembling. The door creaked open, revealing an older woman with kind but tired eyes. Her silver hair was pulled back in a loose bun, and she wore a thick sweater that looked hand-knitted. "Oh, dear," the woman said, her voice warm despite the cold. Come in. You must be freezing." Julie stepped inside, grateful for the blast of heat that hit her. The cabin's interior was cozy, with a roaring fire in the hearth and candles casting a golden glow. A Christmas tree stood in the corner, its ornaments mismatched but charming. Julie noticed how eerily quiet it was, the storm's howling muted once the door shut behind her. "Thank you," Julie said, removing her gloves. "My car got stuck, and I saw your light." The woman nodded, motioning for Julie to sit by the fire. "You're not the first traveler to get stranded in these parts during a storm. My name's Edith." "Julie," she replied, sinking into the chair. "Do you have a phone I could use? Mine's dead, and I need to let my family know I'm okay." Edith hesitated. "I'm afraid the lines are down in this weather. But don't worry, you can stay here tonight. I'll help you in the morning." Julie forced a smile, though unease prickled at her skin. Something about the cabin felt off. She couldn't pinpoint it, but the air carried a weight that made it hard to breathe. "Are you here alone?" Julie asked, trying to make conversation. Edith's expression flickered, just for a moment. "Oh yes, it's just me." Julie nodded, though she couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift, and the Christmas tree's lights flickered sporadically, casting strange patterns on the walls. As the night wore on, Julie grew increasingly uneasy. Edith was kind, but there was a strange intensity to her eyes, like she was watching Julie too closely. The cabin creaked and groaned, the sounds almost rhythmic, as if something was moving within the walls. Around midnight, Julie decided to lie down on the couch. She closed her eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. The fire had burned low, and the room was bathed in an eerie half-light. That was when she heard it, a faint scratching sound, coming from the direction of the Christmas tree. Julie sat up slowly, her eyes darting toward the tree. The ornaments swayed gently, though there was no breeze. Her pulse quickened as she noticed something she hadn't seen before. A small, carved figurine sitting at the base of the tree. It was a wooden angel, its face so detailed it seemed almost alive. Julie stood, moving closer for a better look. The angel's hollow eyes seemed to follow her, its carved smile unervingly wide. She reached out, her fingers hovering over the figure. "Don't touch that." Edith's voice sliced through the silence, making Julie jump. The older woman stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "What is it?" Julie asked, stepping back. Edith's lips pressed into a thin line. "It's just an old decoration. Best to leave it be." Julie nodded, though her curiosity burned. She returned to the couch, pulling the blanket over her shoulders. Sleep came in fits, her dreams filled with strange, disjointed images. The angel's face, the flickering light, and the sound of Edith's voice, repeating a single phrase over and over. "They always come back." Julie woke with a start, the fire reduced to embers. She glanced at the clock. It was just after 3 a.m. The cabin was silent, but a heavy feeling hung in the air, pressing down on her chest. That was when she noticed the angel. It was no longer by the tree. It was sitting on the mantel, its hollow eyes locked onto her. The blizzard came faster than expected. Mark and Ellie were on their way to spend Christmas with Ellie's parents, a tradition they had upheld every year since they started dating. This time, however, they decided to take the scenic route through the mountains, hoping for a picturesque drive with snowy vistas. Instead, they were now crawling along a winding road, the snowstorm growing heavier by the minute. Mark gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles white. The headlights barely cut through the thick snowfall. "I think we should find a place to pull over," he said, his voice strained. Ellie, staring nervously at the GPS, shook her head. "There's nothing for miles. We should keep going. My parents are only 2 hours away." Mark didn't respond. He knew 2 hours in this weather might as well be 20. The car skidded slightly on an icy patch, and Ellie gasped. That's when they saw it, a faint, glowing sign on the side of the road. "North Pines Inn," it read, its letters flickering faintly against the snow. Below, in smaller script, was the promise. Warm beds, hot meals, and Christmas cheer. Mark slowed the car. "This looks like a safe bet. Let's stay here for the night." Ellie hesitated but nodded. The storm wasn't letting up, and the idea of braving the mountain roads any longer felt suicidal. The inn was a tall, narrow structure with dark wooden siding and icicles hanging from its eaves. A wreath decorated the door, and warm light glowed from the windows. It looked inviting, though a bit aged, as if it belonged to another era. Mark parked the car, and the couple hurried inside, their breaths visible in the frigid air. The lobby was quaint, with vintage furniture and a fireplace crackling in the corner. A Christmas tree stood near the front desk, its ornaments mismatched and old. A bell on the counter beckoned them, and Mark rang it. A moment later, an older man appeared from a back room. His hair was snow-white, and his smile was kind but weary. "Welcome to North Pines Inn," he said, his voice warm. "I'm Harold. You folks got caught in the storm, didn't you?" Mark nodded. "Yeah, we were on our way to her parents' place, but figured we should stop." "Well, you made the right choice," Harold said. "The storm's only going to get worse tonight. Let me get you checked in." As Harold handed them an old-fashioned key, Ellie noticed a large ledger on the counter, its pages filled with handwritten names. She found it strange but charming, a throwback to simpler times. Their room was cozy, with a 4-poster bed and a window that overlooked the snow-covered forest. A small Christmas tree sat in the corner, its tiny lights twinkling faintly. Ellie sat on the bed, removing her boots. "It's not bad, considering." Mark nodded, peering out the window. The storm was relentless, the wind howling like a living thing. He let the curtain fall back into place and turned to Ellie. "Let's get some sleep. We'll head out as soon as the weather clears." Ellie agreed, though she couldn't shake a strange feeling that had settled in her chest. Something about the inn felt off. She dismissed it as nerves and exhaustion and climbed under the heavy quilt. The first sound came around midnight. A faint, rhythmic creaking, like someone walking down a long hallway. Ellie stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She glanced at Mark, who was still asleep, his breathing slow and even. She listened, her heart thudding. The creaking grew louder, then stopped suddenly, as if the walker had paused just outside their door. Ellie sat up, her throat dry. "Hello?" she called softly. No answer. She waited a moment longer, then shook her head. "Old buildings make noises," she told herself. "It's nothing." But as she lay back down, she could have sworn she heard whispering, faint and unintelligible. The morning came gray and cold. The storm had subsided slightly, but the roads were still impassable. Harold greeted them in the dining room, where breakfast was laid out, a simple spread of eggs, toast, and coffee. "You folks sleep all right?" Harold asked, pouring them steaming cups of coffee. "Yeah, fine," Mark lied, though Ellie shot him a look. Harold nodded. "The storm's worse up in the pass. You'd best stay another night. It's not safe yet." Mark glanced at Ellie, who shrugged. "We don't have much choice," she said. After breakfast, they decided to explore the inn. The place was larger than it seemed from the outside, with twisting hallways and multiple floors. They passed rooms that looked untouched for years, their doors slightly ajar, revealing furniture draped in white sheets. On the third floor, they found a door marked private. Ellie, curious, reached for the handle, but it was locked. She pressed her ear to the door, half expecting to hear something on the other side. "What are you doing?" Mark asked, his voice startling her. "Nothing," she said quickly. "It just feels like no one's been up here for a long time." "Yeah, because it's private," Mark said, pulling her away. "Come on." That night, the strange noises returned. This time, it wasn't just creaking. Ellie woke to the sound of footsteps again, but they were accompanied by a faint tapping, like fingernails on wood. She nudged Mark awake. "Do you hear that?" Mark listened, his expression darkening. The tapping grew louder, then stopped abruptly. Mark got out of bed and opened the door, peering into the hallway. It was empty. "I'm telling Harold about this tomorrow," he said, shutting the door firmly. But Ellie wasn't convinced they'd find answers. The third day brought even more snow, trapping them indefinitely. Harold apologized profusely, offering to waive their room charges for the trouble. But Ellie noticed something odd about him. His demeanor seemed strained, as if he was holding something back. That evening, Ellie couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow in their room felt like it was hiding something. She decided to take a walk, hoping to clear her head. As she passed the locked private door on the third floor, she stopped. The air here felt colder, heavier. On impulse, she tried the handle again, and to her surprise, it turned. The door creaked open, revealing a dark room filled with cobwebs and dust. In the center of the room was a single rocking chair, its seat occupied by a porcelain doll. The doll's face was cracked, its glass eyes staring blankly ahead. Around its neck was a sign, handwritten in shaky letters, "Do not move." Ellie backed out of the room, her heart racing. She didn't know what to make of it, but she knew one thing for sure. Something was very wrong with this place. That night, everything came to a head. The sounds in the hallway were louder than ever. Footsteps, tapping, and now a faint, echoing laugh. Mark and Ellie sat up in bed, clutching each other as the noises grew closer. Then, the door to their room swung open. Standing in the doorway was a shadowy figure, its outline barely discernible in the dim light. It didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, its presence filling the room with an icy dread. Mark scrambled to turn on the bedside lamp, but the bulb flickered and died. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice cracking. The figure stepped into the room, and Ellie screamed. It wasn't a person. It was the doll from the third-floor room, now life-sized, its cracked face twisted into a malevolent grin. They ran. Down the stairs, through the halls, out into the snow. The storm stung their faces, but they didn't care. Behind them, the inn loomed, its windows dark and unwelcoming. When they reached the road, they flagged down a passing plow truck. their words tumbling out in frantic bursts. The driver took them to the nearest town, where they explained what had happened. But when the authorities went to investigate North Pines Inn, they found nothing but ruins. The inn had burned down 20 years ago, the fire consuming everything, except, they said, a single porcelain doll found sitting in the ashes, its face cracked but intact. Christmas Eve had always been special for Olivia. It wasn't just the holiday itself, but the ritual of decorating the tree late at night, the warmth of hot cocoa, and the twinkling lights casting a golden glow over the living room. This year, however, everything felt different. For the first time, she was spending the holiday alone. It hadn't been her plan. She'd intended to fly home to her family, but a last-minute work crisis had grounded her. Flights were scarce, the weather unpredictable, and her boss's insistence that she stay to oversee the project sealed her fate. Her tiny apartment in the city was a far cry from her parents' cozy house, and as much as she tried to convince herself otherwise, the emptiness weighed heavily on her. Around 8 p.m., after finishing a lukewarm dinner, Olivia decided to distract herself by decorating the tree. She bought a small artificial one at a discount store a few days earlier. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. She plugged in the string of lights she'd purchased, smiling as the soft colors flickered to life. She hung the ornaments one by one, each carrying a faint memory of Christmases past. As she reached for the last ornament, a delicate glass star, her phone buzzed on the coffee table. She hesitated, then set the star down and checked the screen. It was a text from her neighbor, Mr. Halverson. "Hey, kiddo. Merry Christmas. Heard about the work stuff. If you need anything, just holler." Olivia smiled faintly. Mr. Halverson was an older man who lived across the hall. His wife had passed years ago, and though he rarely talked about it, Olivia suspected Christmas was hard for him too. "Thanks, Mr. H. Same to you. Just finishing up the tree." She placed her phone down and reached for the star again, positioning it at the top of the tree. The lights flickered, then dimmed slightly. She frowned. Maybe the bulb connections were loose. She'd check it later. For now, the tree was finished, and it looked beautiful. The clock struck 9 as she settled on the couch, sipping her cocoa and scrolling through her phone. The city outside was quiet, muffled by the snowstorm that had begun earlier. She couldn't remember the last time it had been this silent, even on a holiday. A faint knock at the door broke the stillness. Olivia frowned. She wasn't expecting anyone. She set her mug down and approached the door cautiously, peering through the peephole. No one was there. Her heart gave a small flutter, but she shook it off. Maybe it was the wind or a neighbor's prank. She locked the deadbolt for good measure and returned to the couch. Minutes later, the knock came again. This time it was louder, more deliberate. Olivia froze. She glanced toward the door, her breath catching. "Hello?" she called out, her voice unsteady. No answer. She approached the door again, her steps hesitant. The peephole revealed the same empty hallway, bathed in the dim glow of the building's emergency lights. Her pulse quickened as she stood there, hand hovering over the lock. Something felt wrong. "Who's there?" she demanded, louder this time. The silence was deafening. Deciding not to engage further, Olivia stepped back, grabbed her phone, and dialed Mr. Halverson's number. It rang twice before he picked up. "Olivia? Everything okay?" His voice was gruff but concerned. "Mr. Halverson, did you hear? Anyone outside? Knocking on doors?" There was a pause. "No, I didn't hear anything. You sure you're not imagining it? Old buildings can creak something fierce." "I don't think so. It sounded," she stopped herself. It sounded too intentional, but saying it aloud felt silly. "Stay put," he said firmly. "I'll come check it out." "No, wait," Olivia protested. But he'd already hung up. A minute later, she heard his door creak open and the shuffle of his slippers across the hallway. She pressed her ear to her own door, listening as his steps grew closer. "Nothing here," he called through the door. "Hallway's clear." Relieved but still uneasy, she opened the door a crack, peering out at him. He stood in his usual plaid robe, holding a flashlight. His brow furrowed as he scanned the corridor. "Maybe someone messing around," he said. "Or the wind, like I said. Either way, keep your door locked." "Thanks, Mr. H." she said, managing a small smile. He nodded and returned to his apartment. Olivia locked the door again, this time sliding the chain into place. She told herself to stop overthinking. It was Christmas Eve, and the last thing she needed was to let her imagination run wild. An hour passed. Olivia was back on the couch, wrapped in a blanket and flipping through channels. She'd almost convinced herself the earlier knocks had been a fluke when a new sound reached her ears. It wasn't a knock this time. It was scratching. Her blood turned cold as she realized it was coming from her window. Slowly, she turned her head. Her apartment was on the 5th floor, and the storm outside was howling. Yet the sound was unmistakable. Long, deliberate scratches against the glass. She didn't move, didn't breathe. Her mind raced. It had to be a tree branch, though she knew there were no trees close enough to her window. Maybe it was the wind carrying debris, though the sound was too precise, too deliberate. The scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by a faint tap. Tap, tap. "Is someone there?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. As if in response, the lights on her Christmas tree flickered violently, then went out entirely. The room plunged into near darkness, save for the faint glow of the city lights filtering through the blinds. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table. She jumped, the sound like a gunshot in the stillness. Trembling, she picked it up and read the text. It was from an unknown number. "Let me in." Olivia's hands shook so hard she nearly dropped the phone. She stared at the screen, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Another message appeared. "You invited me when you turned on the lights," she screamed, dropping the phone and running for the bedroom. She slammed the door shut, locking it and bracing herself against it. Her mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion. Was this a prank? A horrible coincidence? But how would anyone know? A noise from the living room made her heart stop. It was the sound of something heavy, dragging across the floor. Then came the voice, low, guttural, and inhuman. "Olivia." The silence after her name was deafening, a vacuum that pressed against Olivia's ears, making her heart pound harder with each passing second. She remained braced against the bedroom door, her mind racing. Every sound outside felt amplified. The creak of the old wooden floorboards, the faint rustle of movement, and the distinct scrape of something heavy being dragged across her living room. "Olivia," the voice repeated, this time slower, softer, as if coaxing her out. Her breath hitched. Whoever, or whatever, was out there knew her name. She clutched her phone, frantically typing a message to Mr. Halverson. "Someone's in my apartment. Call the police. Please hurry." Her fingers trembled so much she had to retype it twice before hitting send. Seconds felt like hours as she stared at the screen, waiting for a reply. Nothing came. The silence outside her door stretched on. But Olivia wasn't naive enough to believe whoever was out there had left. Her mind replayed the messages she had received, the words digging deep into her growing terror. "You invited me when you turned on the lights." What did that mean? The lights? The Christmas tree? Her thoughts spiraled as she tried to make sense of it, but logic offered no answers. A sudden knock at the bedroom door made her yelp, her body lurching backward. It wasn't a polite knock. It was hard, deliberate, almost playful. "Olivia," the voice said again, dragging her name out like a taunt. "Why are you hiding?" Her chest tightened. She pressed her ear to the door, listening. The air outside seemed charged, humming with a strange energy she could feel even through the thick wood. Then came a sound that made her stomach churn. The jingle of Christmas tree lights being dragged across the floor. "Let me in," the voice whispered, so close it felt like it was right on the other side of the door. Olivia stumbled back, her knees buckling. She couldn't think, couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Her phone buzzed in her hand, jolting her back to reality. A reply from Mr. Halverson. "What are you talking about? Your apartment is dark." Her heart dropped. She read the message over and over, her mind rejecting the implications. Dark? How could it be dark? She had left the tree lights on when she'd run to the bedroom. The glow of the city should have been enough to illuminate the living room, even faintly. Before she could reply, another message came through. "I'm outside your door." Olivia's throat tightened as she stared at the words. The hallway door? No, it couldn't be. She hadn't heard the sound of anyone entering her apartment, let alone leaving it. But then came the unmistakable knock on the front door, distant yet distinct. "Olivia, open up," Mr. Halverson's voice called from the hallway. She froze, her instincts screaming that something was wrong. The voice was his, but there was something off, a cadence, a tone that didn't quite match the kind old man she knew. Her phone buzzed again. "Don't open it. It's not me." Her stomach twisted into knots. Her breaths came faster, shallow and panicked. If the message was real, then whatever was outside her door, whatever was pretending to be Mr. Halverson, was something else entirely. The knocking on the front door grew louder, more insistent. At the same time, the voice at her bedroom door returned, its tone dripping with malice. "You can't ignore me, Olivia. You invited me. Don't you want to see what I've brought you?" Her entire body trembled. She had no idea what to do. Trapped between two horrors, her options felt non-existent. She clutched the phone, desperate for a solution. Her fingers hovered over the dial screen, ready to call 911, but a faint noise from behind her made her freeze. The closet. The door was cracked open, just slightly, though she was certain it had been shut tight when she locked herself in the room. A soft rustling sound came from within, barely audible but unmistakable. She stared at the darkness inside, dread coiling in her gut. Before she could react, her phone screen flickered and went black. No matter how many times she pressed the power button, it wouldn't turn back on. The knocking at the front door stopped. So did the voice outside the bedroom. The silence returned, thick and suffocating. Olivia felt trapped in a bubble, the pressure building until her ears buzzed. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs refused to move. And then the bedroom door creaked. Not the closet, the bedroom door. She watched, paralyzed, as the lock on the doorknob slowly twisted. Her makeshift barricade, a chair shoved under the handle, creaked as something on the other side pushed against it. "I told you," the voice whispered, low and menacing. "You invited me." The chair groaned, the strain of pressure bending it inch by inch. Olivia scrambled backward, her eyes darting for anything she could use as a weapon. Her hands found the bedside lamp. She yanked it free, holding it like a club, her breaths coming in sharp gasps. The chair gave way with a loud snap. The door swung open, revealing nothing but the darkened hallway beyond. The air felt colder now, as if the heat had been sucked from the room. The Christmas lights she'd used to decorate her window were strewn across the floor, tangled and twisted, their bulbs shattered. "Where are you?" Olivia whispered, her voice trembling. Something moved in the shadows, quick, skittering, too fast to follow. She swung the lamp in a blind panic, the ceramic base shattering against the wall. The noise seemed to provoke whatever was in the room. A low, guttural growl echoed, followed by a breathy chuckle. "Look behind you." She didn't want to, but her body betrayed her. Slowly, she turned her head toward the closet. The door was wide open now, and within the darkness, a pair of glowing eyes stared back at her. A hand shot out, pale, gnarled, and impossibly long. Olivia screamed as it grabbed her wrist, its grip cold and unyielding. She thrashed, kicking and swinging, but the thing dragged her closer, its eyes gleaming with predatory glee. In her struggle, her free hand brushed against something cold and metallic, the broken remains of the lamp's base. Without thinking, she grabbed it and swung with all her strength. The thing let out a screech, its grip loosening just enough for Olivia to break free. She bolted from the room, her bare feet slipping on the scattered Christmas lights. The hallway was a blur as she sprinted toward the front door, her only thought to escape. She flung the door open, expecting to see Mr. Halverson, or something pretending to be him, but the hallway was empty. No neighbors, no sounds, just the faint hum of the building's heating system. She didn't stop. She ran down the stairs, the echoes of her footsteps chasing her like a phantom. When she reached the lobby, she burst into the snow-filled night, her breath fogging in the frigid air. The storm had passed, leaving the streets eerily quiet. A figure emerged from the shadows. She braced herself, ready to run again, but it was Mr. Halverson, his face pale and concerned. "Olivia, what happened?" he asked, rushing to her side. Her words came out in fragments, whispers, scratching, glowing eyes, but he seemed to understand enough. He led her to his apartment, where he called the police. When they arrived, the officers found her apartment in disarray. Lights shattered, furniture overturned, claw marks gouged into the walls. But there was no sign of anyone else. No glowing eyes, no inhuman hands. Only the faint scent of pine and something metallic, like rusted iron. Olivia never went back to that apartment. She moved out before the new year, leaving behind her belongings, her Christmas tree, and the memories of that night. But even in her new home, she couldn't escape the feeling that she was being watched. And every Christmas Eve, without fail, she would find a single, broken Christmas bulb placed on her windowsill, a reminder of what she had invited in,